Hey guys, is this loud enough? Is this all right? Yeah? So this is a kind of funny juxtaposition of topics, and I think that when I first talking to these guys about it, the amount of data, you start thinking about, you walk around Ken, and like the amount of data that advertising has been using and tapping into over the last 15 years has been unbelievable. The billions of Facebook users, billions of tweets, billions of Google searches, and more and more and more. And the conversation around, the promise of AI is that it's going to help us use that data more quickly, more efficiently, and more effectively. But, and there's a joke, I think, in this industry a little bit about how there's not really even a consensus of what AI actually is, let alone what it can do. But meanwhile, in far from a joke, obviously, countries around the world are investing billions of dollars in AI R&D. And I mean, I've read the term that we're in the early stages of an AI arms race. So, obviously, these two topics, advertising and warfare, there's a lot of differences between them. They couldn't probably be more different, but there is some common ground, and that's what we're here to talk about today. I'm joined by Andrew Shebbeare, the co-founder and chief product officer of Essence Global, and Jivan Gjorginski, hope I got that right, sorry man, a diplomat, and I'm going to read his title because chair of the United Nations Working Group on Lethal Autonomous Weapons. So I want to start, just because we're in Ken and given Jivan's area of expertise, maybe we'll start with, maybe get a breakdown of what you do and a simplified version of the state of AI in warfare and autonomous weapons.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and I guess you can notice the one who didn't
You're from the UN.
Suitably.
Yeah.
But thanks for the invitation, and I think that there are a lot of things that are in common, and those things, the fact that everybody's trying to explore this new field that is opening up in front of us. And when you say that there isn't agreement on what that is, we kind of went in the UN through that hurdle as well. So at the beginning, the attempt was to try to define what are autonomous weapon systems, and that didn't really go nowhere because there's different views of what that is. But we should also remember that AI has existed for about 50 years. We've had autopilot on planes for at least 35 years. The difference is that until recently, it was kind of an if-then function. People are writing the code. And what is happening right now in AI is the fact that the approach has been this deep neural learning, this machine learning, deep neural networks and machine learning, which is you have a very basic algorithm and you feed it a lot of data, and from different kinds of behavior, and then you let it figure out what are the kind of results that it comes out with. So what we've tried to do is to put some kind of a normative framework around it, to try to understand what that is, because we've all watched Terminator, we've all watched a lot of things that scare the heck out of us in terms of combining this artificial intelligence with weapons. And there is concern, there's a lot of concern by many. Some think that actually AI and these kind of autonomy in weapons can actually help make these weapons or warfare more humane. That's the argument of some. The argument of others is we can't really just put this out there and hope for the best. So the GG, the group of governmental experts that I chair, is dealing with this and trying to find this normative framework that is based on consensus. And consensus is not always an easy thing to accomplish. But people are engaged, very engaged. So I'm going to, this is where we're at.
Okay.
And we'll hoping to have some outcomes perhaps this year, but certainly in the near future, in terms of how we see normatively this development.
Well, speaking of lack of consensus, I was talking about how, I was saying earlier, like maybe it's part marketing and part where people are selling services based on AI, but to get your sense of, Andrew, where AI is right now in advertising.
Yeah, it's difficult to follow Jivan. I think we in advertising, we like to think of everything we do as life and death, but this literally is. And even among the hubris of Can, it's hard to kind of follow on that. But I do think there are some really important parallels. In particular, I believe that advertising is one of the spaces where we're going to see AI evolve and become applied the most rapidly, because we deal in words and pictures are easy to manipulate with data and algorithms. So I think while advertising may seem relatively trivial next to warfare, I do believe that we are in some ways a bit of a harbinger as an industry for some of the changes that we'll see in other sectors. And I'm an enormous believer in the positive power of AI in advertising. I believe it is the way that we will restore balance to this kind of three-legged stool between advertisers, publishers, and audiences, which is currently looking a bit wobbly. I think it's difficult to find sustainable economic equilibria, and using AI to basically understand audiences better, come to them on their terms, and create advertising experiences that are more respectful, more additive, more insightful, more helpful, is ultimately how we fix advertising. So I think this is absolutely key, and I want to embrace it. We're having huge success applying AI already today. A little bit, I guess, parallel to the example of autopilot. Some of that's been quite low-level stuff.
Okay.
We started out with simple optimization algorithms for things like auction-based bidding. We're now in a world where we can use slightly more sophisticated algorithms using lots of multidimensional analysis in programmatic to kind of really try and find new local optima, what ads work for which audiences, when, where, and how. And I think what's interesting right now is that we're evolving beyond those very, very basic sort of low-level optimizations into more insight-led work. And in particular, understanding audiences more deeply, getting to insights that traditional kind of top-down human analytics wouldn't have, can actually make our work more creative, more interesting, and more human. So I think there's a parallel there. For all of that, I talk a lot also about the perils of AI and advertising and some of the risks, which I think we're not yet equipped to meet as an industry. And some of those are quite simple, things like brand safety issues.
Right.
We've seen a lot of that. We've seen advertising as an enabler of filter bubbles and creating questions about ethics there. And I don't think we have sufficient guardrails. I think we've all experienced that in recent, particularly political circles. But I think there are some very simple examples of how an algorithm can get you to an unintended consequence. It's quite easy to see an algorithm that's trying to sell razor blades right now accidentally optimize towards people who have self-harm issues because they're the most responsive. Or to find gambling or alcohol advertising that optimizes towards people with addiction problems. And those are distasteful, they're ugly, and human beings would probably avoid them because we have a sense of normative ethics that machines don't. I also think it's quite easy to sort of imagine a not too distant future with the convergence that we've seen between things like content carriers and the advertising world, where actually unintended consequences of algorithmic optimization start to create issues of bias in society. Imagine a world where an algorithm noticed that the northern United States tends to spend more money through advertising. And so perhaps they deserve more bandwidth. Perhaps they deserve a better internet experience. But perhaps the northern United States deserves more access to premium content. Let's imagine the result of that being racial bias, being societal bias, being unwitting discrimination, that again, I think a human being would never commit. But if an algorithm's given too much freedom, it could quite unwittingly, in trying to optimize a simple problem, create some really ugly problems.
Well, speaking of the parallels, I mean, obviously, the thinking of some of these things, like we've talked about earlier, whether it's targeting, the unforeseen impacts you're talking about in terms of this is going to be great if we can find that right person who loves razor blades or whatever, and unforeseen circumstances of, like the examples you gave. Are there, and again, monopolistic forces, but are there parallels in this sort of thinking and approach? I mean, Jivan, do you see from talking to Andrew as well, like between how you guys are, maybe not we talked a little bit about the implementation of where AI is so far, but in terms of the thinking ahead and the strategy behind where AI is going, some of these parallels, how are you guys approaching this? And maybe from what Andrew was saying, like, are you seeing parallels there with the work you're doing with autonomous weapons?
Absolutely. It's called algorithmic bias, right?
Yeah.
It's something that as I said, like the earlier adoption, if it was like an if-then, now we're kind of just putting in data. Well, there's another as well development, which is you put one machine against another. You gave it the very basic rules, and this happened in chess. I don't know if you know this example that Kasparov was beat in 97 by an AI. Ever since then, AI has developed, and we've made this the best chess player that can ever exist, knowing every possible human move with every possible knowledge about chess. Well, a few years ago, this AI was put against another piece of AI, which had learned on its own. So 2 pieces of machines that had learned chess on its own within 45 minutes. It beat the previous one 94 out of 100 and drew 6 remis. So
wow.
I mean, this is this kind of new development where you put the basic rules and let it learn on its own, right? So this is obviously of concern. We have to, and especially since we don't know what happens in the middle. We put the basic algorithm, we put a lot of data, whether it is in advertising or whatever, and we see the output. But it's the black box problem. What happens in between? How does it learn what it learned? Now, when you combine that with weapons, you need to be extra careful. And the thing is that, I mean, militaries want to be careful. Militaries don't want to lose control over their weapon or weapon system. So we're talking about, in our field, weapon systems. But the danger is that speed is your ally, right? You always try to do things faster, especially than the competitor. And this in statecraft means being able to respond perhaps to a war situation and then not being invaded or dominated in a given field. So when that is the incentive, then you keep on giving more and more autonomy to one system, and then to another system, and then to another system, and then once you have that, you may have the incentives to combine the systems with autonomy. Well, I mean, this is where things can get really dangerous. And so I think that we do have to be careful with how this is being developed. But at the same time, there's good signs. I think that in your industry, I think that a lot of employees, I mean, Google and others, have risen up and said, let's kind of put the brake on this a little bit. Let's be careful in terms of how we do that. And that needs to come up in many different fields, because this is fundamental in the work we're doing. Basically, you're not talking about one weapon. You're not talking about a landmine or a rocket. You're talking about any weapon that can be combined with artificial intelligence. So you're talking about something that is like electricity. The way electricity electrified many tools that existed before, now we're talking about cognifying weapons or whatever it is where you're in your field. So it is that kind of a paradigm shift that we're talking about. So we have to be very lucid about the way we're developing this in our field, in your fields. It is a paradigm shift. It is a game changer for the world, and it can happen like this.
Maybe it's just me. I get terrified when I hear that a little bit, the cognifying of everything. Well, okay. Another commentary, as it applies to this, is sort of the idea of agreed upon consensus, like in regulation, not just what something is and what it should do, but obviously the UN is an organization. You guys working on some of these.
It's us all, guys. You guys are part of the UN as well.
Sometimes it doesn't feel like that, but that's great. But the idea of coming up with a standard of I mean, in the most simplistic terms, like Geneva Conventions and things like that for use of AI and autonomous weapons. Same with the advertising and marketing industry. Like, what are we doing? What are we allowing to do? What are companies doing in practice, and what are they what are they allowed to do? Because obviously there's a lot of concern already around privacy and how that data is being used. And I don't think all our tools are cognified just yet. It's something that's coming down the road, and we're in that. It sounds like we're in that stage where there's a lot of foundation building here that could have lots of implications. So in terms of consensus and regulation, how are you guys dealing with that in your respective industries?
I think and this is one area where, as we've been preparing for this conversation, I think Jivan and I found a lot of common ground. The conversation has changed as a result of this kind of exponential technology becoming applicable in lots of different fields. One very simple, and maybe it's an unfortunate pun, but targeting. Targeting used to be about deciding, in broad brush terms, a population that would be exposed either to weapons or to advertising. It's now about whom do I target, which person do I target potentially. That is a determinism that I think we are not ethically ready for. To say, I'm going to target them, not them, as opposed to I'm going to target this room, implies that I'm making myself accountable for that choice and that level of precision. And I think that obviously introduces a question of risk-reward. How certain do I have to be that that's the right person that I want to show a message to or kill? And what is the risk of exposing the wrong person to my weapon or my ad that I am prepared to take on? Yeah. And because I have chosen an individual, I think we're projecting a kind of new level of responsibility. For me, that says, well, if I'm going to act with that level of confidence, I really need to have a very clear measure of social good. I need to say, I believe society will be better off, or advertising will be better off, if I do this one action. But that exposes really deep questions that are basically as old as civilization. You can trace these conversations back to Aristotle. Yeah. Questions about, normative ethics. What makes a society better off? Is a society better off if, on average, everyone's better off? Or if its happiest member is better off? Or if its least happy member doesn't suffer? And when you think about the risk of exposing, innocent civilians to weapons, or innocent children to advertising messages that are inappropriate, or simply the risk of a brand being adjacent to pornographic content,
sure,
these are the same types of evaluations. Now, to answer your question about regulation and kind of and frameworks, there is a lot of really good work going on in the digital industry, as there is in Jivan's field. And companies like Google, companies like Facebook, consortia like the OECD have put forward many really good frameworks on AI principles. The challenge for me is they are quite high level. So we say most of them will have a tenet that says we must do social good. But
do we agree on
social
what that
good has a ton of different meaning in different places. With the classic example is the self-driving car that has to decide whether to run over the young family, the child, or the old couple in order to save one or the other. And an interesting experiment is to say, well, should that answer be different in Japan, where children are sacred, versus in some Western societies where old people are sacrosanct? And those questions of normative ethics are not problems with AI, they're problems with human judgment and value systems,
right,
which we now have to answer in order to be able to tell a developer how to address a philosophical question.
Well, one thing I was thinking was like the idea of so often in advertising, not in warfare, so often in advertising at least, well maybe, that line of what social good is and what is determined by when people get really creeped out. Like the public response to something. Like there was a New York Times feature that I highly recommend about targeting, about this unknown target that was down to an individual, not name and address, but certainly people, they could identify who these people were based on, from this house to this school every day. Okay, so that's the teacher. Anyway, that creeps people out. And I mean, that story goes into things that are just like beyond, but even the fact that when and people don't even know if it's true anymore, but something like, I don't shop for this brand, I never mention this brand, and it was on the radio, and now it's in my Instagram or where I'm targeting an ad from it. That creeps people out, and often that's when things pull back. It sounds like we're a little bit away from, and when I think of that, and then start applying that sort of to AI, it gets a little concerning. Yeah.
I think that's true. I think there are positive moves in the industry, and I think it's really important that we continue that momentum. So far, and specifically in the area of privacy, I think the impact of that work has been very disappointing. GDPR has done very little for the consumer. It's done a huge amount for companies that control a lot of first-party data, right, and it's helped them consolidate that power. And it's made using the internet a horrible experience for anyone in Europe who's constantly closing pop-up windows.
Yeah.
And I think we have to work harder and continue to evolve that. It's the beginning, and I think it just shows the immaturity of the conversation.
Jivan, what about you guys?
These questions have been philosophical questions for thousands of years. Aristotle before, but now they're engineering questions. So they're not answered by philosophers and moralists and thinkers of that kind. They need to be answered by engineers or coders or So but the thing is that we have the thinking behind it. We've had traditions of thinking for, again, thousands of years in each of our cultures, in each of our civilizations. And we've had as well normative frameworks that have existed. So in our field, for instance, we have something that is called international humanitarian law. And it's, the body that I chair actually exists within something that is called the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons.
Okay.
It exists within this body of knowledge. And that is the law of war. Henri Dunant, the founder of the Red Cross, actually, he's the one that kind of founded both the Red Cross and this kind of thinking of what do you do. He was coming back from, he was traveling and he witnessed firsthand the Battle of Solferino. And he saw a lot of corpses, but he also saw a lot of people who were wounded and nobody was taking care of them. So he started, let's see what we can do. Let's see what we can do about civilians. So this body of work has developed principles like distinction, like proportionality, like precaution, like responsibility, legal responsibility. And this is what we're using in our work, So how does now autonomy in a weapon system apply when you're thinking about precaution or distinction or proportionality? We need to kind of think but the thinking is there. And I think that's important to keep in mind that, we don't need to reinvent a lot of things. We just need to think very hard and with concern about how we implement this kind of thinking.
Okay. Yeah. And we're talking a lot about like where, things are right now in terms of how we're dealing with some of these issues. In terms of advertising, what sort of lessons or where do you think things should be going in the sort of short-term future? I mean, there seems to be a lot of questions being asked. Are any of this even close to being answered anytime soon?
I think it's difficult to pretend that we're going to come up with all definitive answers to all these questions right now. I think what Jivan's work teaches us is that having the conversation is important. We can't pretend this technology is going to go away. Yeah. And we must acknowledge that it has real benefits and talk about those as well. Because it's very easy to scaremonger and talk about killer robots or horrible ads and filter bubbles and political manipulation. That happens, but it also has many, many societal benefits. I think it is going to be about incrementalism. It is going to be about the type of work that Aristotle started and we must continue, and that Jivan's been talking about. I have a lot of faith that there's a lot of goodwill and a desire for this technology to be used responsibly. Never in human history have such a small number of powerful companies controlled these types of assets. And that is frightening, but it's also a benefit because these are companies that have huge long-term interest in their own survival and in the success of this technology. And they are some of the most ethically managed companies that have ever existed on Earth. So I'm very hopeful that the industry can work this through. In order for that to happen, though, I think we all have to manifest our voices, apply pressure in the right places, and ask lots and lots of questions so that we don't just take a too good to be true result to be true or to be okay. Mm-hmm. We have to ask how our data is being used. We have to ask the kinds of sacrifices and risks that algorithms are taking on our behalf and in our name. And I think brands in particular and agencies need to ask a lot of questions of the technology and data companies that they work with to make sure that there's that culture of responsibility. What I would like to do, and what I think a lot of these industry bodies are beginning the process of, is to help pre-frame those questions so that not everyone has to go and do a philosophy degree to be able to go and launch a media campaign. And I think we can equip people with the right tools and questions and frameworks. And I think that's where there's a very clear parallel for me with the work that Jivan has been sharing.
Jivan, what's your sort of, I think I've read your sort of glass half full, glass half empty sort of outlook here on where things are going in your field. I mean, you did tell us a really good story metaphor before we came here today. So I'll let you tell it hopefully here, but which I think framed it well. Just wanting to know what your sort of outlook is and how we should be thinking about it.
If I brought in Henri Dunant in Geneva, let me bring in another person in Geneva who kind of existed in the beginning of the 19th century, and she accompanied her husband on a trip to Lake Geneva, and they were hoping for a good time and beautiful sun and mountains around and lake. what happened is that the whole summer they didn't see any sun. There was only clouds, and that was because halfway across the world there was a super volcano eruption in Indonesia, Mount Tambora, I think it was, and this made them stay at home and basically tell each other stories. And the collection of people there included Lord Byron, who challenged the others to start thinking of different stories and horror stories to kind of scare each other. So young Mary, who later became Shelley, wrote Frankenstein and told the story of Frankenstein in this kind of environment and the important thing to keep in mind here is that Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein, is not the creature. It's actually the scientist who created what he called the creature. And you can notice if you read carefully the book that Mary Shelley is very she thinks that Victor Frankenstein could have done a much better job of bringing up this into being. Mm-hmm. He kind of just let it happen, scared off, and ran away. And then let the creature kind of develop on its own. And the creature was reading Paradise Lost. But the point here is that neither half full nor half empty. The glass is as it is. Let's look at it the way it is. Let's be careful and concerned. We're bringing into being a new species. And we should be aware of this. We're bringing into being something that is going to be much more intelligent in given areas than us. At the moment, it can be intelligent in one area and then the other area. This is the artificial intelligence part. The context-driven, what is called the artificial general intelligence is still far away, but perhaps not too far away. I like this statement of there's nothing more dangerous to humanity than its misunderstanding of the exponential function. Because the exponential function basically goes like this. This example of a bottle that is full, that is empty basically at 11 o'clock, and full of bacteria at 12 o'clock. And at every minute, replicates itself. So in 11 o'clock, 1 bacterium, 11:01, 2 bacteria, 11:02, 4 bacteria. When is the bottle half full? Well, at 11:59. And it's too late if we're waiting for 11:59 to do something about it. So now is the time to start doing things in all of our industries, not with fear, not with something that is going to freeze us, nor with too much enthusiasm, that everything is rosy and just going to be beautiful, but with lucidity and care and concern and bring this being into existence so that we can together co-evolve, because that's the only future that there exists. And I'm a Star Trek fan, and I like that vision of humanity where we go into the stars and become an interstellar species, and AI is an integral part of that. And I would like for us to kind of have such visions and not the dystopic ones, and all of them are possible. Let's keep this beautiful vision forward.
Nice, thanks. Andrew, do you have anything to
It's
add?
hard to beat that description of the future, and I think it's a perfect encapsulation of why we have so much common ground here.
Yeah.
The existential questions and the responsibility to think carefully, but optimistically and cautiously about this technology are exactly the same. I'm a huge optimist. I believe that this technology is essential to the survival of advertising, but it could also be, our undoing if we don't steward it carefully.
Nice. Do we have any Slido questions that we want to? No, not right now. Cool. Well, great. Thanks so much, you guys, for talking about this. It's fascinating. Thanks, you guys, for coming out.
So.